And Laura, it is all yours.
Great, thanks, Rush. Welcome everyone to the Adult Forum today. Before we get started with our speaker, I just want to let you know about a few things Immigration Task Force has coming up. And if you're interested in getting on the email list, it doesn't mean you're committing to joining forever, nothing like that. If you want to get on the email list, let me know or Ann Kleinkopf and we'll put you on the email list. So let's see, on May 16th, 12:15 to 1:30. I'm not sure that's right. I think that's 11:15. Is that an adult forum, Beth? Beth Ertz is going to talk about what she and Chris have, their updates and their news with Maribel, which is the person they've been sponsoring through her asylum application. So that is on May 16th. We'll make sure the date, the hours are right. Oh no, that's on April 18th. Sorry, April 18th. May 16th is going to be our next Immigration Task Force meeting. We're just going to plan, brainstorm, see what we want to work on next. After we hear from our speaker today, we might have some inspiration on what we want to do going forward. So if you would like to come to our meeting, that's May 16th. And then Beth Ertz is going to be talking about Maribel on April 18th. You can keep an eye on the church calendar for those times, or like I said, you can let me or Ann know and we can get you on our email list. So today we have Tanya here from Convivir, Colorado, and she is going to introduce herself and her organization. And then she's going to give us some super interesting information. I've had the privilege of listening to her in a couple different workshops, and I was just like blown away and said that we had to get her here. So thank you all for coming. Tanya, take it away.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today. Good morning. I am actually temporarily in San Diego. So for me, it's actually 10:19, whereas for y'all, it's a little bit later. But let me screen share. It's popping up. Okay, we're here. Awesome. So as we get started, I sort of like to do this quick check-in. We could have y'all write in the chat just your name and then who you're here for today. And if it's someone in particular, you can write their name in the chat. This question is really just to help us ground and like our purpose for being here, because otherwise this is just a random workshop with random information. So go ahead and write your name in the chat and who you're here for today, perhaps someone in the community who is affected by immigration. And if you don't know anyone who's affected by immigration, you could just say, I'm here to gain some knowledge, whatever your reason is. Thank you, Laura, for starting it. Thank you, Mary Lee. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you. Oh, now they're popping in fast. Thank you all. Love it. Okay. So there's definitely, y'all are here for people in your community, as well as people maybe you haven't met yet, like the people at the southern border. I love it. I love it. All of the reasons. And again, this question is really for us to center around, like, we're here for someone. Even if you haven't met them yet, you're here for a reason. And we're going to take the next hour to do the best we can to share some knowledge and to see where we can be in terms of, you know, making a difference in this world that is often crazy. So let us get started. This is me. I'm Tanya. My name is Tanya Titus. My pronouns are she, her, hers, ella, and on the right, you can sort of see a number of the different things that I've done. But I think the most important thing is that I am an undocumented immigrant. Currently, I'm a DACA recipient, which is puts me in sort of a different bucket of undocumented people. And I have been facilitating professional development for educators, for families, for students in English and Spanish since 2011. So there are many, many years of experience in running workshops such as this that I think really help making sure that I'm sharing all the right information with y'all. And we're going to get started about Convivir. So I'm the CEO of Convivir Colorado. We support immigrant and refugee youth, particularly students in 6th through 12th grade. So our middle school students, our high school students. And we really just work with them to encourage self-empowerment, leadership development. The whole idea is for them to find power in their migrant journey and then sort of take that power and do something about it in their community, right? And so we have a number of different programs that we offer to students. We have school-based after-school clubs, which right now are all virtual. We have a statewide advocacy campaign that right now is really working on supporting legislation as it's going through Congress. We have a mentorship program where we pair our high school students with professional immigrants who are professionals. And we have a summer program that I'm going to start recruiting for at the end of this month. It's a 6-week summer program. And we also have Teach the Teacher trainings where I'm working to train up students so that they can lead these kinds of workshops instead of me. That way they can sort of tell people exactly how they want to be supported in life. So we're actually going to start by sharing a video because I think this video really I don't know. I like watching videos. It shows us a little bit more about how things are functioning. So before I start it, let's see. Can anyone mute whatever that sound is? Is it coming from me?
No, Rush, can you just make sure everyone's muted? Except Tanya.
Yeah, I can't tell where it's coming from, but okay.
Mary Kay, I think you're the only one unmuted. Mary Kay, can you mute yourself? There we go.
Awesome. All right, so this is actually a music video from La Santa Cecilia, which is a band group formed out of California. And this music video is a little older, but I absolutely love it. So we're going to play it, and please flag me down if the sound for whatever reason doesn't work, because I know sometimes that is weird. Start clicking on other videos. Thank you all so much for watching that with me. Let's take a deep breath together. I don't know if that was for you as much as it was for me. I should have warned you that it's in Spanish, but I can translate the main chorus, which is one of us stays here, the other one stays over there. And that's what happens just by going to work. And everything else is sort of context, right? But those are that's the main chorus. And so this video gets me really emotional. So I would also love to know, what emotional response did you have to the video as people who are sort of watching it from the outside looking in? And you can go ahead and unmute yourself for this one.
Well, I was surprised when the one young man turned out to be working for ICE.
Yeah, I knew what was coming. And so there was stress, because I knew it was going to come.
Yeah, the constant fear they must live in. It's got to be awful.
I thought the seriousness on the faces of all of them, actually, about how serious life becomes for people who are undocumented and know that any day their life can change forever. The people that played all those roles did a beautiful job.
It was very moving, so short, and yet you got the whole message in a real personal way.
Yes.
Is this the United States or Nazi Germany in 1940? And were those people Jews?
Oof. Thank you all. Yeah, I actually know some of the people in the music video just because as community organizers, we sort of all get interconnected very well. Erica, who was, I guess, the young lady at the restaurant, she went on to work for the Bernie Sanders campaign. Her mother, who was one of the women placed in deportation proceedings, is still fighting deportation. Isaac, I actually haven't heard from in a while. The last I heard of him, he was in California. And the rest of them, I don't know. But it is something that is just so important for people to know about. And, you know, y'all might find it interesting because I feel like y'all are very, you know, aware and involved and engaged. But oftentimes when I do workshops, actually the first thing I have to do is get people to find that empathy piece. Because without that empathy, without you finding the time and the energy to care about someone else whose story is totally different than your own, then the rest of the workshop doesn't really matter. I could give you all of the different pieces of information in the world, and it would just be like, okay, like, I'm so sorry that y'all are struggling. And I know this might, like I said, it might not be as important for y'all since I see y'all are super engaged, but oftentimes when I'm doing other workshops, this is like the piece where I'm like, listen, this is the moment where I need you to start understanding that undocumented people are going through this every single day. And it's very, very critical. So with that, I wanted to pause a moment, or not pause, but really just start everything with mental health. For the undocumented population, mental health is huge. However, most of us don't talk about it because we come from cultural backgrounds where talking about mental health is either taboo, unspoken, something that people don't understand and therefore don't talk about, or shameful to even, you know, discuss the things that are stressing you out. But for our immigrants, there are really this big 4 buckets. There's the fear, which is obvious, right? Fear of deportation, fear of being separated from your family members, particularly for our younger students. It's like, what's going to happen if I get home and my parents are no longer there because ICE picked them up? There's also this anxiety, the fact that we cannot plan for our futures because it's so uncertain. So even myself as a DACA recipient, I have to renew my work permit every 2 years. So I can actually only plan my life out in 2-year increments. And that is terrifying. It's also financial, right? Like if DACA gets taken away tomorrow, how am I going to make money? How am I going to make sure that I keep my mortgage and my job? Similarly for all sorts of other financial things. There's this shame of the media really trying to put wedges into our community and playing the blame game, which we see so much in the immigrant rights movement, right? Where they're like, well, it was their parents' fault for bringing them here when they were young and they had no idea. But then I don't think it was my parents' fault. My parents were brave. They left an entire country and life to come to the United States before they were younger than me when they came. And they learned a whole new language, they got new jobs, they figured out a new culture. That is amazing, that is resilience. But the media really does try to put a wedge in there and sort of do this pointing fingers game. There's also the alienation of, you know, when I was growing up in particular, I think this new generation might be a little different, but when I was growing up, we didn't talk about immigration. I was growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, under Sheriff Arpaio in Maricopa County. And if you don't know him, he is probably Maricopa County's version of Trump for several years. And he was the sheriff, so he would celebrate just like rounding up all the Mexicans and putting them in tent camps. And he would do anything to humiliate everyone. And so when we grew up not talking about it, there's this idea that maybe I'm the only one that's going through this. Maybe my experience is just very isolated in this portion of the world. And that feels very lonely, for sure. There's also the depression. Many undocumented people fall into, well, not many, I don't know actual numbers, but they fall into substance abuse. I think the first time I ever heard about undocumented immigrants on the news was because there was a young man in Texas who had committed suicide because he got into, I think it was MIT, but he didn't think he could actually attend as an undocumented person. And so he committed suicide. And I was like, what? So there's just so much in the realm of mental health that it really puts it into perspective what the undocumented community is struggling through every single day. The fact that we make it to work, the fact that we're involved in the immigrant rights movement, all of that is huge considering what we're up against. But I also wanted to throw in some general facts and information. So I'm going to go through a quick overview of just like statistics. And you'll notice in here, I'll have pictures of different undocumented people in Colorado. So for example, this is Alejandro, and he owns lots of different businesses. He runs lots of different businesses, but I think his newest venture is Combi Tacos. And so if y'all wanted to support him, I can type in the chat the name. Combi Tacos. And I'm sure you could order some food from him. All right. So there are 4 types of immigration statuses. There's our undocumented immigrant population who do not have permission to work or live in the United States because we have no visa, no green card. That is where we have the 11 million. There are temporary visitors who are visa holders for studying, working, here to visit family, or just tourism, right? Just visiting the United States to go to Disneyland or something. There are lawful permanent residents, AKA your green card holders, who can't yet vote or receive federal social services, but they do have that work permit that sort of allows them to be here and fully functioning in society. And then there's your naturalized citizen who must renounce all ties to their country of origin. So these are really just the 4 types of status that you can have. And I tried to find a pie chart that was a little more up to date, but I couldn't. So this is from 2014. But even so, it sort of gives you a little sense of the percentages. So obviously we do have a bigger percentage of naturalized citizens and legal permanent residents. So in comparison to those, undocumented immigrants are not the biggest part of the pie. And definitely the temporary people are also not a biggest part of the pie. But it sort of gives you an idea of where we're at. In the chat or out loud, can y'all tell me what are some characteristics of an undocumented person? Like what things do they have or not have that makes them undocumented?
The right to vote.
No right to vote.
Actually, could I question you about denying former citizenship? I'm English and American. I was naturalized, but I was told by the British Embassy that I have to renounce my British citizenship, or should I say, I'm a subject to the Queen. And I did morally swear to forego my former princes and potentates, but I really have dual citizenship. So is that just one country, or is that not true of all countries?
So I used to think every single country had to renounce their ties, all like allegiance, I guess is the right word, to their country of origin. I think as much more recently, I've realized that it's more nuanced. And so it depends on the country and the political climate of your country of origin. And so, yeah. And so for example, I have a friend who's from Guatemala, and it's like, because of the instability in Guatemala, the US is like, you can't have dual citizenship with them. You have to just cut ties. So it really depends.
But I have both passports, but as I say, I did renounce in front of a judge that I would renounce, but I haven't done it. So, okay, thank you.
Of course.
I'll go back to England if I have to.
Maybe, if you must. There's some comments in the chat of people sharing what makes a person undocumented: overstayed visa, so no socials, no citizenship, no rights, lack of permission, Right, all of those. So I clicked go so that it would come up on the screen that there's 11 million of us, most of whom have actually been in the US for at least a decade, if not longer. Many entered without inspection, and as many as 45% just overstayed a visa. So that, I'll pause there because that one is one of those things that is different. So without inspection is what you would imagine when you hear the media talking about immigrants, like, oh, they jumped the fence or they swam through the river. So without inspection just means they did not cross an actual port of entry and like talk to someone. But 45% of undocumented immigrants in the US did have an inspection upon entry, which means that they did cross through one of those port of entries, talk to someone, and instead have now just overstayed their welcome in the United States. And I was one of those people. My family and I came with a tourist visa, and we did not go back to Mexico after the visa expired. We're living in the country unauthorized. You are correct, we have no social, therefore we cannot work. However, because some of us have these like weird statuses like DACA or temporary protected status, like if I have DACA, so I have a social security that allows me to work, but in 2-year increments. And so there are different like levels to this, but generally a fully undocumented person has no social and cannot work, cannot be employed. I did want to mention that people with different types of visas, like U visas for victims of crime, T visas for victims of trafficking, may also face very similar challenges to the undocumented population. So for many of us, even if we have DACA or a U visa or TPS, we're still so much on the brink of deportation that it sort of feels like we haven't strayed too far. Like we're only a hair better than being fully undocumented. I get this question all the time. Why can't we just get in line or become citizens the right way? And so for that, you know, there's the short explanation is we can't get in line. There is no path. But the long explanation is there are 4 ways to come into the country correctly. So there's the employment-based migration, which is where the United States brings in highly skilled workers. And you'll see this, you know, when they're looking for engineers, or in COVID times, they're looking for doctors. And so they'll sponsor people to come and work in the United States, but it's just primarily high skilled workers. So our low skilled workers generally don't have as much of an opportunity to come. There's family migration, which the Trump administration called chain migration. And this is literally just US citizens petitioning for their spouses, their children, their parents, their siblings. It's got to be a direct contact. It can't be like your second cousin twice removed, or even your first cousin. That would take a very, very long time. Family immigration takes many years for things to sort of, for you to get the green card, for you to get citizenship. So it's a very long and costly process. There's also political refugees, must prove a well-founded fear of persecution. So it is really hard for people to prove that they have a well-founded fear of persecution. Therefore, we often actually don't have a lot of political refugees. Even in countries that have instability, the United States just makes it really hard to prove it. And if you're thinking of like people coming from Mexico, Mexico, certain parts have a lot of violence, and yet no one from Mexico is getting any kind of asylum or refugee status in the United States. The United States has basically just said there are border countries, so no, like no political refugees from Mexico. But they do consider it a little bit more for like Central Americans and people from countries that have war going on. And sometimes it even works for countries that have like climate disasters, natural disasters. But the main thing there is that there's no economic refugees. So people who are fleeing poverty have no way to enter the United States with some kind of invitation. And then there's diversity visa, which is literally just a lottery for countries that are not very represented in the United States. And I wrote down in my notes, which countries. Yeah, Egypt and Nepal are the main countries right now from the diversity visa. So it's literally, it's countries that are not very represented in the United States. They are put into this lottery to come in. So these are the four like main types. There's like subset categories within them. So there's always like very nuanced ways to come in. No one person's story is the same as everyone else's. So like a farm workers visa would definitely fall under employment type of sponsorship, but those are sort of temporary. So it's a very particular type of subset because they can only be here for like seasonal work and then they sort of must return. So yeah, and then things like victims of crime fall a little bit in a different category. So there are definitely other nuanced categories. These four are just like the big umbrellas, if that makes sense. Some numbers. In Colorado, we have 190,000 undocumented immigrants, which is about 3.4% of the population. The national average is 3.3. So Colorado is, hovering kind of on par with the national numbers. And I normally present to educators. So I always like to say that 10.6% of our K-12 students actually have an undocumented immigrant parent, which means that if you think about it, when we talk about undocumented immigrants, the 11 million are just the undocumented immigrants. Just imagine how many mixed status families are in existence where there's undocumented people, but someone in there has DACA, but someone else in there has a U visa, and someone else in there has a naturalized citizen. And so there's so much that could be happening within any given family unit. Now, I also wanted to share that there's some numbers around which countries are represented from undocumented people. So we do have the largest percentage of undocumented immigrants from Mexico and Central America. But that is closely, not very closely actually, but that is then followed by people from Asian countries. And then, it sort of gets lower from there, from South America, and then from Europe, Canada, Oceania, Caribbean, Africa. So it sort of, goes from there, but Mexico and Central American immigrants are our highest percentage for sure. And I agree with your statement around how this country really does need to revise how it functions with its need for labor, and really treat our laborers better, right? Because if people are coming in seasonally, I feel like this country really just exploits a lot of its temporary workers for sure. And just so you know, I am going to be sharing this slide deck with y'all afterwards. I should have mentioned that at some point. So you will get this slide deck to hold on to and review afterwards on your own. Okay, so I'm going to talk quickly about some best practices, some resources. The picture here is of an undocumented trustee to the University of Metropolitan State University of Denver, which is, I think she's the only undocumented person ever to hold a position such as that in the state of Colorado, which is super cool. So actions we start with. Language is super, super important, so critical. First of all, I think we all know, drop the I word. No one should be using the word illegal. No human being is illegal. We're just not going to do that. We're not going to dehumanize an entire human based on an action. And so that is just baseline. There are other terminology that people would like to sometimes use. So if you don't like using the word undocumented, some people just use unauthorized. Also never use alien. I am not an alien. I'm not like a little green person with an antenna or something weird. It just feels so.
Are you there? Yeah.
Oh, but yeah, I was saying it just feels so dehumanizing to be called like an illegal alien. So don't do that. And in terms of coming out of the shadows, so prior to 2010, the like really big vote for the DREAM Act back then, the undocumented youth, so a lot of college students, were building up this narrative about being undocumented and unafraid. And they started this process called coming out of the shadows, which really mirrors the LGBTQ movement's coming out of the closet. And that's mostly because the immigrant rights movement has largely been led by trans queer women of color across history. Trans women of color have been the leaders. And so a lot of the movements between LGBTQ and immigrant rights have a lot of interconnections between them, including the fact that when we share our stories as being undocumented, it's a bit of coming out and sort of telling the world about our identity. And so for other people, it's really important to honor whoever you know is an undocumented immigrant. They have the choice when, where, how they want to share their stories with you or with others or with the public. And it's your job just to listen and hold confidentiality, of course. Also, a little bit more nuanced understanding that the Dreamer narrative really encourages this good versus bad immigrant narrative. And so when we start talking about how dreamers, and the term dreamers came from the DREAM Act, but when we talk about dreamers as being young people who made no mistake of their own, they were brought here by their parents, it sort of gives you this sense that they are the only type of immigrant that we want, and everyone else is not good enough. And so even though this has been a narrative that's been shared for many, many years now, I think a lot of people in the immigrant rights movement have tried to start moving away from it and start calling for no criminalization of our community, so that we know that there isn't just going to be valedictorians like coming into the country. Like, we have to sort of have a more holistic approach to welcoming our neighbors. And so I prefer not to be called a dreamer, because I think that sort of criminalizes my parents. However, some people might embrace the term dreamer. So when you are sort of referring to an undocumented person, it's okay if they call themselves dreamers, because that's sort of their ownership, but I wouldn't ascribe that to them, if that makes sense. And then lastly, encourage civic engagement as a means of self-empowerment. The reason that I got it going as a community organizer, as a public storyteller, as an educator, is because I started feeling that semblance of control when I was doing something about immigration and immigration policies. Without getting engaged in doing something, I sort of just was feeling down and depressed about my situation and the fact that politicians control everything. And so definitely encourage people to get engaged at their own level of comfort, of course, as a way to sort of build up that self-empowerment. Can I get any answers to, is it safe to be public? What do y'all think? Is it safe to like publicly share our stories?
I could only speak to my experience with Maribel, who we sponsored and are still have very close ties to. And there are times where she feels safe being public, and other times she feels very unsafe. And a most recent example that I could share, most members of the church know that this has gone on, is even trying to approach her landlord about rent because she sees the landlord like the cartel. And so that causes fear. And that if she shared that, for sure, she would be evicted and he might report her to ICE. She thinks he's like the cartel and ICE. I had her in a liquor store with me one day just to buy a bottle of wine and a 6-pack of beer. And one of the ICE officers from the detention center walked in and made eye contact with her, and she was hysterical. And then proceeded to tell me stories, and she was sure that he would just take her back to detention that day. And I'm constantly reassuring her that those things are not not going to happen while she's with us. And trying to teach her how to be self-confident, and to be able to be seen as a viable and great person living in the United States.
There's so much trauma, right? Like there's just so much that we sort of experience and then process, and then it follows us wherever we go, for sure. Thank you for sharing.
It's not part of her culture to seek mental health assistance. And if you do seek it, it's only temporary.
Right.
You need to seek it for a long time. So that's a piece of education and experience you have to gain.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing. And those of you in the chat, yeah, this is a very hard question. Is it safe to be public? Definitely depends on the person, and it definitely depends on the audience. I am very safe sharing my story because I am young, and for some reason this country values younger people more than older people. And so I am young, I am educated, I went to college, I have a master's. I'm in the like 1% of undocumented immigrants who have a master's degree. I have no accent, and therefore people can pretend that I've been here my entire life. And so for me to share my story is so much safer than if a Black man is sharing their story, right? And, you know, you can sort of do anything in between and sort of get in the nuances of that. And then in terms of audience, yeah, for sure. Some people, you know, one thing is, when I was growing up in Arizona, people would often threaten to call immigration agents if something was ever wrong. And I think for a lot of our community, that does happen, particularly in employment situations, where employers will be like, I will call immigration agents if you don't do X, Y, or Z. Or whenever payment was withheld from like my father, for example, if he wasn't getting paid, the people would just be like, oh, well, I don't have to pay you. Otherwise, I'll just have to call ICE on you. And so that is often a threat. However, it's not a real threat because calling ICE doesn't do anything. So there is also that level of understanding, right? That any person I talk to about my story, even if they call immigration agents will say, well, is there some kind of violent act happening right now or a giant drug offense? And if the answer is no, then they'll be like, well, great, like, I don't know what to tell you, because ICE agents function inside of the system. They function with information that they gather from other agencies or that they have from law enforcement agencies. So that is something to note. The only thing I'll share in terms of is it safe to be public is the undocumented and unafraid movement really came about because we realized that every time we share our stories, we have more people we can count on. If I am ever put into deportation proceedings, I now have like 20 other people that I can call up and say, hey, please sign my petition, please help me raise some money, please like share X, Y, and Z so that I can get out. And, you know, that is how I see my sharing of my story, because that means that the more public I am, the more people will stand up for me. Whereas for people who don't share their stories publicly, oftentimes they'll get deported in less than 2 hours and no one knows, because people will be like, oh, I didn't even know that you were undocumented. I didn't even know that I should worry about you being gone. So it's really a personal choice. It's really something that can depend on each person. And money can't buy oneself out, but it can hire you an attorney. Yeah. Okay, moving along. So obviously we need to worry about undocumented people's basic needs. This means that if your organization can have a fund dedicated to whenever someone like it gets deported and now the main income earner of the family is gone, will they need things like clothes, food, like access to food pantries, like what are the things that they will need, as well as a fund for defense, right? Like access to lawyers is huge. Right now, I mean, obviously the United States makes sure that everyone has an attorney, but undocumented people don't really count. And so we don't get attorneys when we're trying to fight our deportations. A big thing right now during COVID time has been evictions for undocumented people. And I don't have a very clear answer other than 9 to 5. The organization 9 to 5 has been working on eviction moratoriums for the past year. They were able to get one, but it still wasn't working out too well for the undocumented community. And so I know that they're still sort of fighting to make sure that our undocumented immigrants aren't being evicted from their homes. Another important thing is that ITINs allow undocumented individuals to do a lot of things, including rent an apartment, open a bank account, pay taxes, and more importantly, register a company. The United States doesn't care if you're an immigrant, and they want all the businesses because they're a capitalistic society. And so any undocumented person can start a company and then start making income by contracting with people. So that's why my father, for example, has his construction company, because then people are contracting his company instead of employing him. And so therefore all the money that he makes is totally fine and within the system. Thank you, Laura. It's an individual tax identification number that you can get by applying through the IRS. And so that definitely helps people. The main thing there is that if you're trying to help people register a company, it's not just about running a company, right? Like they're going to need some services about like knowing how to do bookkeeping and accounting to make sure that their company sort of stays afloat. It is possible for undocumented people to get ITINs. Anyone can get an ITIN, but people with a social don't need it. So it's really just undocumented people who get ITINs, and that's how we file taxes. So so much money in taxes gets taken from undocumented people because of the ITINs that they use to work. Resource sharing. Wow, those were a lot of S's. That was hard for me. Resource sharing is really important, of course. You can do know your rights workshops, family emergency plan workshops. Some of those are led by the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition or COPA. I can lead some in Spanish. So there's plenty of organizations that can run these for your community. There are legal nights and citizenship classes. So lots of different resources. Some of that comes through libraries. I know lots of libraries who have citizenship classes. And then of course, I think CIRC, it always has workshops that are trying to help green card holders apply for citizenship. And so there's different ways that you can share all of this information with your communities. But the most important one is the Colorado Rapid Response Network. So this is a 24/7 hotline that if you are witnessing a raid, you can call this hotline, speak in Spanish or in English, and a dispatcher will answer and ask you a series of questions, and then we will send out a confirmer, and the confirmer goes out to the location that you said, and their job is literally just to confirm, is this immigration enforcement or is this something totally irrelevant? Because sometimes people see a bunch of cop cars and they worry that it's a raid. And so the confirmer will go out and, find out, is it cops doing a drug bust, or is it just a giant car accident, or is it actually immigration enforcement doing something, asking people for documents? So they'll go out, they'll confirm what it is. If it is immigration enforcement, we'll actually then communicate with whoever's involved. If we can figure out who is the target, then we'll communicate with them to help them know their rights. If we can't connect with whoever's the target, then we'll connect with the caller and tell the caller, what the options are. And we'll post it on Facebook so that the rest of the community knows to, not go to that part of town. So definitely follow the Colorado Rapid Response Network on Facebook so that you can stay up to date on reports of immigration enforcement. And this link I won't show you right now, but it's a video that sort of just shows how the process is of calling in for people that are concerned about what that might look like. And I know particularly for our immigrant community, I would be like, I don't want to call a random phone number and tell them that I'm witnessing a raid. So the video really sort of, shows like, this is what happens and this is why it's okay. I think y'all might be interested in the sort of context behind sanctuary churches. So there was a DHS Morton memo in 2011 that essentially said schools, churches, hospitals, and public protests are considered sensitive locations. And what this means is that immigration enforcement should not happen in these sensitive locations. However, the important thing here is this is not any type of law at all. This is just a practice that they like to do, which means it's kind of up to them to follow. Most of immigration enforcement officials, like the leaders at the top setting the rules, will continue to tell their people, like, yeah, just stay away from churches and schools and hospitals, because they do get in a lot of trouble when they do something like that, because the community knows that they shouldn't be there. And so oftentimes it'll get blasted all over social media, it'll end up on the news. So immigration agents just generally wanted to not do that. So for y'all, obviously, this means that there's an opportunity to make sure that churches, yourselves, other places of worship are sanctuary and safe for people, and really publicizing that to the community. But there's a lot of considerations for that. For you internally, even if you don't have a title of sanctuary church, it is important to think about, you know, is there ever a time that you ask people for an identification card? Did you tell them that it's okay to have a foreign identification card versus a US one? What kind of data do you ever collect? Where do you keep it? You probably shouldn't keep undocumented people's information anywhere in one location. What happens if ICE requests information or comes onto your grounds? Do you have a plan to alert your community, your families in their languages? What proactive and crisis response services and systems are in place for y'all? And I know some of this you might already be doing in practice, but it's maybe not solidified somewhere. So it is helpful to sort of think about, like, who is going to call the Colorado Rapid Response Network? Who, at what point do you send out an email blast to your community? Who's going to do the quick translation, things like that. And if you wanted to learn more about sanctuary resources, AFSC is really the leader in that work, the American Friends Service Committee. And so they have a video on how to offer sanctuary. They have a whole toolkit. It was published in 2017, so definitely things have changed a little bit since then, but I think it's a very good starting spot to get some answers as to how it begins. And of course, it's one of the big things to note is that Colorado does have the most number of churches providing sanctuary to immigrants than any other state. So when you think about sanctuary churches, Colorado is really the leader. So there's a lot to learn from people here who have already been doing this. And of course, there are women in sanctuary who are experiencing it. Like this picture is of Jeanette, but there's other women in sanctuary in Colorado as well. Now we keep going on Maslow's hierarchy. Love and belonging needs. Obviously, language access is huge, huge, huge. And then connecting people to others. Like I said, I often talk to educators. So these are some of the ways that students can get connected. For community members, I think it's just a matter of figuring out their needs, right? And so figuring out if they have a legal need, like who do I connect you to? If you have a mental health concern, who do I connect you to? So it might be a little bit more resource connection for adults. But love and belonging is just so important so that we don't feel alienated. There's a question in the chat. How prevalent is the underground in getting Social Security cards to undocumented people? I don't know how prevalent. I don't have statistics on that. I think it was much more prevalent back in the day. It was easier for that to happen. The generation before me. But now I think people are starting to realize that they can have companies and just do everything above board. And so I've seen a lot more people just start the LLCs with their ITIN. But I do not have statistics on Black market socials. All right, moving right along. For this one, I kept a lot of statistics in here that you can look at later. I'm not going to go through them right now. But for example, 69% of undocumented immigrants are essential workers, which also then means immigrants have a 50% more likely chance to contract the virus than those born in the US. And they don't receive any of the supports, which is insane. Really makes you question things. But this is the slide that I wanted to share with you, that undocumented immigrants are indeed eligible for the vaccine. The concern is really just, again, as Elizabeth was saying earlier, just interacting with people of authority is so scary. It's terrifying. And going up to officials who are trying to give you a vaccine and having them ask you for an ID, oh my gosh, again, terrifying. So states are required to collect info. Colorado isn't very stringent on collecting info. So it's actually fairly okay for people to feel a little more safe in Colorado because they won't really ask you for much. But there have been releases, like news releases from immigration agents affirming that they will not collect any of this information. This information is just to track vaccines and how vaccines are being distributed. So if any immigrants are asking you about vaccines, tell them like, yes, it's okay. Please go get your vaccine whenever you're eligible. And a lot of them are also concerned about public charge, but public charge is currently on pause. This was the sort of wealth test that the United States was doing for green card applicants. It's on pause right now. It keeps sort of bouncing back and forth. So I just tell people, you know what, it's changing too often for me to keep track of now. So if you have questions or if your community has questions, they can visit the website Protecting Immigrant Families, and it has all the updates on public charge. And I also get the question about like, well, so many COVID sites speak only English, like our community really isn't working out too well there. And so I always suggest Clínica Tepeyac. They always speak Spanish. They're always amazing. I highlighted them because they're my favorite resource to share. The other ones are ones that I found, but I don't have as much experience with them. In terms of stimulus checks, it changes every time. In this last stimulus, the one in March 2021, every family member with a social gets a payment, and those who lack one would be excluded. So if a mom has a social, she gets a payment, and dad has an I-10, he gets no payment. And that has been different every time. Some key points in our last minute. DACA is back. DACA, people can apply to DACA in its full glory. And so this means that DHS is taking initial DACA applications and applications for advanced parole, which is where many of us could leave the country for education, work-related or humanitarian reasons. A lot of people aren't applying to advanced parole right now because we're in the middle of a pandemic, and so we can't really travel to other places. But it is important for some people to travel because then they can get that stamp that says that they came in with an inspection, which then changes their opportunities for applying for a green card later. And last year, they were only doing 1-year DACA cards. And so this year, when we restored DACA, everyone who only had a 1-year permit was extended to the full 2 years. There's a lot of policies going on. So many. There's been 53 immigration bills introduced in 2021 in federal Congress. You may have heard of some of them, like the DREAM Act. It's been, introduced since 2001. So this is like the upteenth time that it's been introduced. And most importantly, the American Dream and Promise Act passed the House last week. This would be a path to citizenship for Dreamers, temporary protective status recipients, and deferred and forced departure beneficiaries. So these are a bunch of temporary status people. So it would provide a path to citizenship for them. That's about 3 to 4 million people. Then the Farm Workforce Modernization Act also passed the House last week. And this provides a path to citizenship for farm workers. A lot of people don't like this bill because it acts as if they still need to sort of prove that they're worthy. They have to pay tons of fines. They have to be here for many, many years, and they have to, there's a lot of little hurdles to jump through for them to get their path to citizenship. So AFSC, for example, opposes this bill, but it did pass the House last week. Most people are actually just hoping that Biden's bill is the one that passes, because Biden's bill is the most progressive, most inclusive bill we've seen in the past decade. It provides a path to citizenship for all 11 million undocumented people, and it changes a bunch of stuff in the immigration law so that there's fewer visa backlogs and a lot more opportunities for people to come here legally. And just to put a little graph to it, Biden's bill, the US Citizenship Act of 2021, says that people would enter the prospective immigrant status and then green card status and then US citizen for a track of 8 years, which is faster than for most people. And then people who are dreamers, TPS holders, and farm workers actually get to skip a step and only do a 5-year track to citizenship. So again, super progressive bill, but some of us are not too hopeful that it'll pass. In Colorado, we do have some bills that are being sponsored by CIRC, the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, such as data privacy to make sure that the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles, is not sharing information about the licenses with immigration enforcement, because they actually were. And so many of our undocumented people who are getting the licenses, even though our licenses are marked, we have a little black box on our license. The DMV was sharing that with ICE. And so some people got detained because of that. They're also trying to get a legal defense fund that is statewide, not just Denver, so that people can access attorneys. And if you would like to submit any kind of written testimony, please do so. There's this form here. And again, you'll get the slide deck with the links and everything. So I covered all of that super fast, mostly because we're out of time. The rest of the slide deck, actually, that was pretty much it. Yeah, great. So this slide deck will be emailed to you. You can follow Convivir Colorado to see any updates on policy, because, you know, from now until May, there's going to be a lot of changes, I think. And that is it. We can sort of do a quick checkout, but I know we're also out of time. So I don't know what you want to do. Oh, there's some questions here. How can we be allies? Replay the video. Okay. For main ways to be allies, I think summary is number one, always listen to the undocumented community. As with any directly impacted person, you listen to their needs. And from there, it's really about uplifting their narratives, because we know what we want and what we need and what we've experienced, and no one else can share my story better than me. And so if you uplift our narratives, it would really just be about ensuring that our voices are the ones in the news, our voices are the ones heard by legislators, that we're the ones making decisions on behalf of ourselves. But other than that, really just listening to people, trying to push for policies that are inclusive of everyone, and making sure that that we do the best we can, really. Honestly, it's about bravery for me, like the way I see it. If my parents can be brave enough to bring me to a whole nother country, then I can be brave enough to run workshops, and you can be brave enough to learn more, and you can be brave enough to call your senators. And that's just what it is. And the video will be linked in here, but I'll make sure it's in the email follow-up. How do I use donations? So I work with youth. I work with youth. And so for me, donations will go to working with our students, to making sure that we have enough programming with local schools. Right now, I am working on expanding to different schools, because most of my programming is in Aurora and Metro Denver. So I'm looking to get beyond and start like moving up to Boulder, Westminster, Fort Collins, Pueblo, so that students in places that don't have as many resources can get to connect with each other and ensure that, you know, they're feeling like they are the ones in power. So all of that is to say, I'm sorry I went over by like 5 whole minutes. I apologize, but here we are. I will, in the email follow-up that I'll send to Laura, I'll include a survey so that you can sort of let me know if you have any pending questions, or if, if there's anything else. Any last thoughts?
Tanya, I was just wondering, do you probably just addressed this and I was looking at all these things in the chat, but do you accept donations if anyone from this conversation wants to donate?
I do, yeah, and I can send you the link. The bit.ly is generally here, but it's not linked
Okay.
in. So I'll link it in. That way, when you click on it, it'll take you directly there.
Great. Sorry for making you probably repeat that. I'm just putting in the chat the next session we have coming up in case you want to join that with us. And I feel like there's another thing I was going to ask Tanya before you leave. Oh, wow. Beth already just donated. Thanks, Beth.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful presentation, and I will stop recording now.
Thanks. Sorry, I talked so